Okay, we're going to get started this morning. I want to welcome everyone to New York Law School and one of our extraordinary city law breakfasts. I'm Anthony Crowell, the Dean and President, and it is fantastic to see so many old friends and colleagues, and I am always so pleased with the turnout at these breakfasts. We have an extraordinary program today with Pat Foy, and I think so many of you will appreciate to gain an even deeper understanding of the Port Authority. I know we have many professionals here from the Port Authority itself, but for those of you who have worked with the Port, I think we'll get a deeper understanding of what it does and where it's going. At New York Law School, we are really proud to call ourselves New York's Law School, and that's because we like to be involved in all things New York, helping to move the city in great directions, providing legal advice, policy advice, and training an extraordinary group of new attorneys to go out and help lead with all of you. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to Ross Sandler, who will do more formal introductions. And Ross, as you know, is a professor here, former City Transportation Commissioner, and he is the director of the Center for New York City Law. Ross.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this is the 112th City Law Breakfast. We've been doing these now into our 20th year. It's hard to believe. And we're very fortunate to have sponsors, Greenberg Traurig, law firm of Greenberg Traurig, and Ed Wallace, who has been our friend for many years, is here. We'll give him a call. Also, Con Edison, which has been a longtime sponsor, and Verizon have all been very well. The idea of these breakfasts is to have open forum. There is microphones, and we'll have questions and an open discussion at the end of the talk. But I wanted to thank Pat Foy for coming here today. His position is really one of the most important in the city, and perhaps not as well known as the one we just elected a few weeks ago. But in terms of what people enjoy and see and do in New York City, the Port Authority is really critical and has been since its creation almost 100 years ago. Yeah, thank you, Alice. Obviously not a toll payer. I looked. Pat Foy has had one of the legal careers that make other lawyers jealous. He did Fordham Law, Fordham undergraduate, has worked in local government in Nassau County. He's worked for Power Company LIPA. He has been a partner at Skadden Arps. Not only was he a successful partner there, but he also headed offices in Europe, where he spent time as a transactional and corporate lawyer. He has moved back and forth from government to law, and also has a distinguished career in the not-for-profit area as well. So he comes with an enormous amount of experience. I actually expected an older man, but it's something that is quite wonderful. And I went back and I looked at one of my favorite books, Sarah Kaufman's Governing New York in 1960. And of course, they're writing at the time of Robert Moses and Austin Tobin, who was the head of the Port Authority at that time. These, of course, are giants in the construction infrastructure in New York. And there's a very long chapter on all the authorities at that time, and that was, of course, rather new. And I looked at it has one paragraph which I'd like to share with you about what it takes to be a leader of one of these authorities, particularly the Port Authority. And what it says is, the leaders of the authorities thus face many of the same problems as their colleagues in regular bureaus and departments. The survival and growth of their organizations are their responsibilities. For reasons of their own, they have program objectives that they would like to see attained. In the face of all the pressures confronting them, they find these duties are not easy to discharge. The task requires great ingenuity. Every advantage must be seized, every weakness guarded. They must know their opportunities and recognize their hazards. So I present to you Pat Foy, who is sitting in that position today.
Thanks very much. It's good to see so many of you took the advantage to be indoors today and not outside at the transition tent. I'm going to tell, since group of lawyers and law students, I'm going to tell two quick law stories. One is Austin Tobin, who Professor Sandler just mentioned, was the longest-serving executive director of the Port Authority and really made the Port Authority. Book to read, by the way, since Professor Sandler cited the book, is Empire on the Hudson, which is the definitive book about the Port Authority. But Austin Tobin was a senior lawyer in the Port Authority Law Department, as is my colleague Carleen McIntyre, who's here today, and a number of actually our colleagues in the Law Department, Tim Stickelman at the Port Authority and Margaret Finnecune, senior lawyers and New York Law School graduates. But Austin Tobin was offered the job of executive director and sent a note to his aging mother asking for her thoughts on it and expressing concern that becoming executive director would stand in the way of his real long-term goal, which is to become general counsel of the Port Authority, which gives you some insight into which gives you some insight into the importance of the law department at the Port Authority and the influence of that position. The other thing I want to do is I just want to read a brief letter, and this is just intended to provoke the lawyers, law students, and deans and professors in the room. It goes back to 1944. January 29th, 1944, the Little Flower, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, sent a letter to the presidents of 7 major airlines, including Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, a legendary figure in his own right of Eastern Airlines, now long departed, and Juan Trippe, also a legendary figure in the aviation world, Pan Am. And his letter was, the mayor's letter was about plans for what today is JFK International Airport. And the letter, I think it's fair to say, featured Mayor LaGuardia at his acerbic best. And I'm going to quote directly from the letter. Quote, "This is the last call on the matter of the runway layout at the new airport. Thursday, February 3rd, 1944, at my office, City Hall, at 2:30 p.m. o'clock, come prepared," this is the letter to the 7 heads of the airlines, "to make any suggestions or forever hold your peace. I have heard some groaning about the present layout, which I know is not justified. If you have any cockeyed ideas on any tangent runways that have not yet been tried out, keep them for some other time. I am willing to hear constructive criticism and to receive helpful suggestions. I cannot compete against white tablecloths and soft pencils. Everyone who gets 2 drinks under his belt is now designing runway layouts on restaurant tables." The letter finishes, and I don't mean to be too provocative or to offend, but I'm going to read the letter since it's a matter of historical record. "You may bring anyone," the mayor writes, "you desire from your engineering, technical, and piloting staff." The following sentence is underlined. "Lawyers cannot contribute anything. This is not a legal matter. Very truly yours, F.M. LaGuardia, Mayor of the City of New York." Now, I'm a recovering lawyer and don't subscribe to that view, but I thought I would mention it. I want to congratulate Dean Crowell and Professor Sandler for everything they've done for the City of New York and the law school and with the Center for New York City Law. I also want to thank my friend and colleague Darren Block for inviting me this morning. Obviously, New York Law School has been an incredibly important part of the legal and governmental and business community in New York City for a long time. And I particularly want to commend the Dean for his leadership on the issue of whether you can get law students through with a quality education in a 2-year period instead of 3. I think it's an issue that's very much in the forefront these days, given the economic times that we live in. Here's what I'd like to do this morning, and I'm happy to take questions as I go, or comments or interruptions, or wait till the end. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of infrastructure, which I think is a given to everybody in this room, but focusing particularly on the current burdens that the state of our infrastructure in this region creates on the economy today, which is basically a polite way of saying that job creation is being impeded and economic activity and wealth creation is being impeded by the current state of our infrastructure. Talk about the role for public-private partnerships and some of the things that the Port Authority is doing on that subject, and then talk a little bit about the environmental process, which in my mind is, and Mark Chertoff, a leading environmental lawyer, is here, and I know that Professor Sandler has lots of experience and war stories in that field, but I think the current environmental process is broken. It's too long, it's too uncertain, and it's too expensive. Some may disagree. So I'm not everybody here is familiar with the Port Authority assets, the region's airports, bridges, and tunnels. George Washington Bridge, busiest bridge in the world. The ports on both sides of the Hudson Path commuter rail system, 77 million passengers a year. And then somehow, as a result of long ago actions of Governor Rockefeller and his brother David Rockefeller, the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, we're in the real estate development business, which is not a core competency of government, but we finished the core and shell at One World Trade Center, and the World Trade Center site is nearly done. But the Port Authority's main business, and I think we're in a phase where we're returning to core mission, is developing and maintaining and operating public transportation infrastructure in this region. The American Society of Civil Engineers, which is admittedly a self-interested group, right, has estimated that on a national basis the amount of deferred investment in transportation infrastructure in the United States is $2 trillion with a T. Admittedly a self-interested group, but even if they're off by 10 or 20 or 30 or even 40%, a huge number, especially when you take into account the national economy is $15 trillion with a 2. So having a deficit of $2 trillion on a national basis, huge number. Today, however, our economy is burdened by the state of our infrastructure. I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. Partnerships in New York City did a study several years ago and estimated that the air traffic control congestion delays in the New York region, and for this purpose it includes Philadelphia because that's the way the FAA counts it, but let's put Philadelphia aside, which I think we're all happy to do. Current annual cost to the region's economy is a little under $3 billion a year from air traffic control congestion. On an annual, on a basis from 2008 to 2025, the partnership estimated current burden on the region's economy over that period $80 billion, which means that there will be people who will not have jobs because those jobs won't be created, or there are people who will be underemployed, or lots of people will not be able to take advantage of their full human potential. A real problem, especially in the current environment we live in. Traffic congestion, studies have indicated, is a current burden in this region alone to the tune of $5-6 billion a year every year, significant part of that truck congestion. Obviously, with congestion comes other externalities, emissions into the air, wasted time. It's hard to be terribly productive when one is stuck in a car. But the point is there are current burdens and drags on the region's economy as a result of the state of our infrastructure. There are fixes to these things. For instance, I'm not going to get too far afield into this unless people are interested in a Q&A session, but for instance, there is technology available called NextGen to deal with some of these air traffic control congestion issues. I'll just note an extraordinary thing. The average New York City taxi uses more sophisticated, not has, more sophisticated GPS technology than the airliner that's now landing at LaGuardia. The airliner has more sophisticated GPS technology, but as a result of the FAA air traffic control system, it doesn't get to use it. Bunch of reasons for that. The solution is something called NextGen, which we are lobbying hard at the Port Authority to be installed first here in New York. It's a multi-tens of billions of dollar investment. Obviously, these are tough times, including for the federal government, but that's a problem. And the same thing's true with everyone. The congestion issues and the burden on the economy I cited is true not only at airports and not only on bridges and tunnels, but it's also true at our ports and it's true at PATH as well. Point one. Point two is that I think Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, established and proved what everybody and confirmed what everybody in this room knew, which is that the public transportation system in this region, MTA, Port Authority, New Jersey Transit, DOTs on both sides of the Hudson, are critical to this region's economy, and when the public transportation system is taken down, as it was by Sandy, for several days, and obviously with all due respect to our friends at Con Ed, there wasn't commercial power for a significant period of time, at least in the southern part of Manhattan, because of the severity of the storm. But when the public transportation system is taken out of operation, New York City and the region come to a halt, and the storm had a short-term toll on the economy measured in billions of dollars. And that's why everybody, Governor Cuomo, Governor Christie, have been so focused on making sure that we build resiliency and mitigation in going forward. Third point I want to make is, and this is, I think, readily apparent to anybody who pays attention, and obviously folks in this room, governments at every level, to use a technical term, are broke. And there's no reason to suggest that that's going to change anytime soon. Growth is desperately needed for lots of reasons. I think growth is a good thing, frankly, on almost every level, including from an environmental point of view. I think environmental quality is enhanced, not degraded, when the economy grows, because new assets and new facilities are almost new jet engines. New large container ships are almost always more environmentally friendly than their predecessors. Jet engines are quieter, they use less fuel. Newer jet engines, quieter, use less fuel. Larger container ships are more attractive from an environmental point of view than the ships that precede them. But governments are broke at every level, and that's true of the federal government, too. There's an extraordinary article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal this week where the Joint Chiefs of Staff are thinking about paring back military pay and benefits and housing allowances and all that kind of stuff, which is something that's been sacrosanct on every round of military budget cutting beforehand. And the answer is at every level of federal, state, and local, and in every program, the economy is not generating enough wealth to pay for the current programs, to say nothing of the entitlement deficit that governments at the local, state, and federal levels face. And one way to get out of that is growth, and I think growth is a good thing. Public-private partnerships for a second. When you think about it, much of the public transportation infrastructure in this region was built with private capital. That's true of Grand Central Terminal, it's true of Penn Station, it's true of the PATH, which was a private company called Hudson in Manhattan, it's true of the PATH tubes, it's true of the tunnels from New Jersey to Penn Station, it's true of the New York City subways, which were built by competing investor groups, it's true of the Long Island Railroad, it's true of LaGuardia Airport. A lot of the transportation infrastructure was built with private capital. The historians and the skeptics in the room will say quite rightly, well, Pat, that's right, but every one of those assets ended up in public hands, and that's true for various reasons, changes in business conditions, leverage, government action, lots of reasons, which creates issues that one has to anticipate and deal with in today's public-private partnerships. But the point I want to make is that the use of private capital to build transportation infrastructure in this region and frankly around the country and around the world is not a new thing or a threatening thing or an extraordinary thing. It's part of the history of the region. A book I commend to your reading on the subject, if you're interested, pretty readable book, is called Conquering Gotham, which is about the building of the original Penn Station and by the Pennsylvania Railroad at a time where railroads were railroads, and also the building of the tunnels from New Jersey to Penn Station. A really good book about the challenges that the Pennsylvania Railroad faced in doing that. So Port Authority on public-private partnerships has a long history of being a leader. In the mid-'90s, we privatized the International Arrival Terminal, Terminal 4 today at JFK Airport. It's now run by Schiphol, which is the Dutch Amsterdam, actually, airport group. They're quite good operators. We have a great partnership with them, and that deal's been in place since the mid-1990s. We've long partnered at the airports, all of them, with the airlines and cargo companies who invested substantial amounts of private capital, and that continues today. But taking advantage of the reality that governments are broke, and while the Port Authority in the next months, I expect, will adopt a capital plan of about $27 billion over 10 years, even that doesn't address all of our needs. A lot of money, substantial amount of money. Port Authority continues to be a AA credit, which is a pretty good credit in today's environment. We're actually out today pricing $1.5 billion of refunding debt, which we think will result in net present value savings of tens of millions of dollars, a little less than $100 million, but a substantial amount of money, and enough to go to the trouble of refunding that $1.5 billion. But despite the fact we're a good, terrific credit, and the fact that the board will consider a capital plan shortly of $27 billion over 10 years, we don't have enough to do it all. And the American Society of Civil Engineers estimate kind of gives you some sense for the investment deficit on a national basis that somehow has to be dealt with. So here's what we're doing on a current basis. We just had achieved financial close, thanks to Carlene and Tim Stickelman and a lot of their colleagues at the Port Authority Legal Department, on a new PP, public-private partnership deal for the Goethals Bridge. Goethals connects Staten Island and New Jersey. 80-year-old facility, 10-foot lanes. If you've ever traveled on the Goethals next to a truck, it's a pretty foreboding experience, and one that one doesn't forget. And the bridge is functionally obsolete. If we propose to build a bridge like it today, there's no way that any level of government would allow us to do it, but it's grandfathered. And it's also a critical piece of infrastructure because it links New York with Newark Airport and the ports, including Howland Hook in Staten Island, which is the largest private sector employer on Staten Island. Incredibly important part of infrastructure. So we closed in the last couple of weeks, financial close, with we ran what I thought was a really robust competitive RFP process, and are doing a public-private partnership with Macquarie, which is one of the leading infrastructure investments worldwide, originally an Australian group, but now international, and Peter Kiewit, one of the largest private contractors in the United States. We believe we'll achieve a 10% savings in construction and O&M cost over the course of the deal. Very low cost of capital. Obviously, private equity demands a higher return than tax-exempt governmental financing, but we were lucky to get a $500 million TIFIA loan, slightly under 500, but 500 is close enough for sake of discussion. TIFIA is a U.S. DOT program. Governor Cuomo just achieved a substantially larger TIFIA loan on the Tappan Zee Bridge. And I'll talk a little bit about the governor's leadership on Tappan Zee and I think the lessons it has for the environmental process in a couple of minutes. But TIFIA is a perfect source of financing for a long-lived asset like a bridge. It's basically treasury rates, 40-year term, and no debt service is payable until the bridge goes into service. So here's what we did on Goethals to protect the Port Authority from the risks of the public transportation infrastructure funded by private capital that I talked about at the beginning. One is significant equity investment from the private developer, $100 million. So they've got $100 million reasons to make sure this bridge succeeds. One is Port Authority continues to own the bridge. We continue to collect the tolls. We continue to set toll policy. Thank you, Professor, for that kind reference to tolls. I was hoping we could go without mentioning them. And we continue to set toll policy. We think it's a governmental function that shouldn't be outsourced. And most importantly, or as importantly, we don't begin to pay back the developer until the bridge is 70% complete. So the risk of making a payment and the bridge is 5% and it kind of fails for some reason, we don't really have that. And then beyond the $100 million equity investment, the development team will receive incentives or penalties depending on how good a job they do maintaining the bridge. For instance, if there are more lane closure hours or days than set forth in the operating agreement, they'll receive more or less money depending on the performance of the bridge. The other thing it does is because the development team is going to be in the deal for 40 years, it will tend to make sure that they don't build a bridge on the cheap. And obviously what we've given them is a set of pretty detailed specifications from the Port Authority in terms of what the bridge needs to look like, but more importantly, the standards to which it's built, and that will ensure that their interests and those of the public sector, in this case the Port Authority, are aligned. Second project we're in the midst, so Goethals is closed and construction is just about to start. Extraordinary time because we are building at the same time two bridges at the same time. New Goethals Bridge, and then we're raising the roadway, not a new bridge, but we're raising the roadway on the Bayonne Bridge to allow larger container ships to come in, and I'll talk about that in a second. Central Terminal Building at LaGuardia. So Central Terminal Building is where American and United and JetBlue fly out of. Everybody in the room has been in it. It's in dreadful condition. We're not proud of it. Port Authority owns and operates it. And there have been this built in 1964, New York World's Fair. Mets lost 100 games. Not much has changed. Yankees played the St. Louis. Sorry. I grew up in Queens. I'm a big Mets fan, but we got to face reality. Yankees played the St. Louis Cardinals in the World Series. 1964 is a long time ago. And it was built to serve about 8 million people, and it serves 12 or 13 right now, and it's just kind of busting at the seams, and it's not a very good experience. From a business point of view, the retail at the Central Terminal building is pre-security. Building was built obviously long before 9/11, and in today's world, consumers want their retail post-security because no one wants to be drinking a Starbucks and realize I got to run through the flight and the TSA line is longer than anticipated and miss the flight. So that it doesn't work on any level. So we have an active RFP out, and I'm going to be guarded in what I say, especially with my counsel sitting there. I believe an active RFP out. We've identified 4 world-class teams. Central Terminal building is about a $3.5 billion transaction. Goethals was complicated. This is way more complicated because we've got airlines and other regulators to deal with. And we expect that the same type of construction and innovative ideas and reduction in operating costs that we achieved on Goethals will be realized in Central Terminal building. Footnote, both Goethals and Central Terminal building will be built with union construction labor, and the people, whether Port Authority employees or employees of contractors working there, will be union members, including 32BJ, which a long, long time ago was good enough to send me to college, and I have a real debt of gratitude to the union for that. So we're going to make sure they're going to be union construction workers and union folks working in the facilities. $3.5 billion deal, as I said, $2.5 billion for the terminal, about $1 billion for related infrastructure, of which the board has already approved about $700 million or so. That work is underway. You can see it at LaGuardia today. For instance, there's a new East End substation that's being built. Governor Cuomo visited it on a tour that the governor and Secretary Donovan from HUD and Tom Prendergast from the MTA and I did on October 29th, the first anniversary. And work is well along on the new East End substation, as well as other electric and other infrastructure at the airport, and ultimately work on new roadways. The current Central Terminal building is about 750,000 square feet. Old, tired. New building is going to be about $1.2 million and change. Retail, substantially better retail offerings. And if you take a look at the new Delta Terminal T4, you've got Shake Shack and Blue Smoke and Marcus Samuelson and other food options, and we expect similar options at the Central Terminal building. Substantially larger, better retail, better customer experience, and it'll also allow larger jets to access some of the gates at the Central Terminal building, which will allow increases in throughput and capacity without additional flights, which is obviously an issue for the neighborhood, and without building additional gates. Just a word on the World Trade Center, since we're in the area. A couple of things. One is at this point the core and shell is finished. We're going to start the Condé Nast fit out early next year, and Condé Nast will be moving in about a year later. We're about 70% of our net income goal. As a result, we're partners with the Durst organization, one of New York's great multi-generational real estate families, and the Dursts have added tremendous value. We're at 70% of our net income goal, in part because of a unbelievably good deal that a team at the Port Authority made with Legends, which is a partnership for the observation deck. So we're going to get about 15% of the building's net income from 3 floors at the top, the observation deck. Legends is a partnership of, again, a product of a robust competitive RFP process. Is a partnership of the New York Yankees. Give it up for the Yankees. Dallas Cowboys, OK to boo, and Dave Checketts, who used to be president of Madison Square Garden in a prior life. World-class entertainment observatory sports arena company. We think it's going to be a terrific experience for the millions of people who are going to visit that, and as well as we're not putting any, Port Authority not putting any capital up. Legends going to invest north of $60 million and a terrific experience. Lots of private capital also at the World Trade Center. We're 50-50 partners with Westfield, leading Australian retail REIT, at the 400,000 square feet at the World Trade Center. So again, more private capital being used by the Port Authority. Talk briefly about the environmental process, and then I'm happy to open it up to questions. So I asserted before the environmental process is it's too long, it's too expensive, and it's too uncertain. And I think it suffers from a couple of other disabilities. One is false precision. With all due respect to Mark and the other environmental lawyers, and I know Professor Sandler is a lot of environmental expertise and experience in his background. The thought that, for instance, when Governor Cuomo got elected, the Tappan Zee environmental process had been underway for 10 years to the tune of $80 million. I would suggest that there's no endeavor of human activity, including the Tappan Zee, that would benefit from an 11th year of study and another $8 million of expenditure. The false precision point is the following. The idea that there's a traffic engineer, to pick on traffic engineers for a second, who was smart enough to figure out what the traffic on Broadway and Worth Street is going to be 22 years from now at 5 o'clock on a Thursday before Christmas is absurd. And the false precision built into it allows clever lawyers and other advocates with various agendas to kind of pick at it and to say that it's not going to be 64 and a half cars, it's actually going to be 65 cars, and as a result we ought to kind of start over. That's insane. Bayonne Bridge, use that as an example and something I think important and innovative that President Obama did, which we were able to take advantage of. So the Bayonne Bridge, I mentioned, second bridge project we've got underway. We're not building a new bridge, we're raising the roadway of the new bridge. So we're not knocking a bridge down, no environmental impact there. We're not building a bridge, we're just raising the roadway. So why are we doing that? The current roadway of the Bayonne will not allow the larger super container ships that are currently being built in shipyards in Europe and Asia to access the harbor, or at least to access all of the container terminal operations but two. Global on the New Jersey side, and Red Hook Container Terminal in Brooklyn, which is, frankly, the smallest of our container terminal operations. So we're raising the roadway of the bridge to allow these larger container ships to come in. The larger container ships are going to be larger, carry more containers, burn less fuel per container, and they're going to burn less fuel per iPad or stick of furniture or whatever is in them compared to their predecessors. They're going to be more fuel efficient. And another big environmental issue in the shipping world is ballast water, right? Ballast water is the nasty water, noxious, in some cases hazardous water in the bilge and the hold of the ship. And as you can understand, there are very strict environmental regulations around the world about discharge and treatment and filtering of bilge water ballast water as there ought to be. The new ships are going to have the latest technology, the most advanced filters, etc. And the next 5 or 10 environmental issues, the newer ships are going to address them because their owners are going to require it and because regulators around the world are going to require the same thing. So from an environmental point of view, not only job creation, the Bayonne Bridge and the continued growth of the port will lead to job creation, and hundreds of thousands of jobs on both sides of the Hudson directly and indirectly arise out of the port operation. But it's a good thing from an environmental point of view, but the way the environmental process is set up, there's no advocate for growth and jobs. And it's solely an environmental point of view, and I think it's more complicated than that. So here's what President Obama did, and I think it was a revolutionary program, needs to be expanded. In 2011, the President announced a new federal infrastructure dashboard, which would allow select important projects around the country to file for an expedited process, and basically the promise of a lot of attention, a lot of focus from the White House, which is almost always helpful. I'm proud to say the Port Authority is the first agency in the country to file for this expedited treatment for the Bayonne Bridge. We were awarded that treatment, and I think it helped expedite the processing and the permitting of the Bayonne Bridge. If you believe the data that the American Society of Civil Engineers cites, that we've got an infrastructure investment deficit of $2 trillion, and that it's a current drag, the lack of infrastructure investment and the deferral over a period of decades is a current drag on economic growth. It seems to me it behooves governments at every level to figure out a way to expedite the environmental process. I mentioned the Tappan Zee and Governor Cuomo's progress and success in advancing the environmental review on that. And, I said, kind of in a jocular sense that, another year or two probably wouldn't have advanced terribly the understanding of the environmental issues on the Tappan Zee Bridge. I believe that. And probably another 8 or 10 or 15 or $20 million of environmental study probably would not also advance the understanding of those environmental issues. And I think that the NEPA process, which is the federal process, and to some extent regional processes, need to be rethought and more focused on, especially and I ought to make this clear, especially with respect to replacement of public transportation infrastructure. So if an advocate or a developer is going to come in and want to build a nuclear plant on a pristine mountain lake, different thing. If you're talking about replacing a Tappan Zee Bridge, there's a bridge there already, or you're talking about raising the roadway of the Bayonne, or you're talking about replacing the Goethals Bridge, another asset-oriented place, or suspender ropes on the George Washington Bridge, or a new central terminal building at LaGuardia, there ought to be a shorter, more streamlined, and less uncertain environmental process to allow us to get there. Last point I'll make is that growth is good, and it's good not only in terms of job creation and job retention and wealth creation, and creating the tax revenues that governments at every level need to operate, but it's also good, I believe, from an environmental point of view, because it creates not only the wealth to fund environmental programs, but new technologies, whether new jet engines or new technologies in terms of tolling, or new technologies at the ports. And for instance, in the ports, both sides of the Hudson, we've been very successful in reducing significantly the amount of emissions as a result of clean energy and renewable and other technologies. We continue to be focused on that. So the takeaway, and I'm happy to answer questions, is PPP is going to be a big part of the Port Authority's approach. It doesn't fit every deal. We did it on Goethals, for instance. Right decision. We elected not to do it on the Bayonne Bridge. I think also the right decision. But we're going to be looking at public-private partnership opportunities on every transaction that we did, given the fact that we too have limited resources. Governor Cuomo, just one final note, was able to achieve a couple of years ago the passage in New York of design-build legislation. I think there are 48 states ahead of us. Design-build is being used on the Tappan Zee, will be used on other projects by the DORM and other state agencies, and I think is an incredibly important project, an incredibly important development and success at the state level, because design-build leads to, in most cases, a more cost-efficient delivery system and less of this, which is one contractor blaming the other, real success at the state level. So thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, we're going to have questions. You come to the microphone, and we'll take people in order. Well, let's start with you, and then I have a question myself. So
Sorry,
go ahead.
You want to start? My apologies.
Well, let me just ask a question. When I was in government, we used to look at the Port Authority with great envy because you had the ability to hold and attract really good engineers. How are you doing in hiring and keeping and the engineering corps, the people at the port?
Really good question. I'm not an engineer. I guess I've spent a lot of my career as a financial engineer, so I'm acutely aware of our limitations. Our the chief engineer of the Port Authority has long been a honored, respected position. Our current chief engineer is a unbelievably talented, capable guy named Peter Ziff, and I think he continues that tradition. His predecessor was Frank Lombardi. Port Authority pay and compensation packages, I think are I think are competitive. I'll also be frank that in a market like this in New York City, where construction is red hot, and one could ask whether there's a residential bubble. I don't have a view on that, but there are construction and cranes sprouting up everywhere. That the private sector, which can pay more and always has the ability to pay more, is attracting some of our engineers. It's frankly right now within historical limits, but it's of great concern to me and the board and Mary Lee Hannell, who's our head of engineering.
Oh,
Please.
sorry. I made notes so I'm coherent. I'm Alice Labrine. I live on the Manhattan side of the Harlem River at 147th Street, and I say that because I'm conscious of rivers. The applause, Ross, is because I'm all commerce all the time, and I appreciate our maritime industry. And I would like to say how proud I was to discuss my Port Authority on my Mississippi River paddle wheel cruise. There were people who kept asking me about our port here. My question is, I'd like your comment on the cruise industry. And second, your comment on could the Port Authority take over the MTA?
So I'll deal with the second one first. I spent a couple of years on the MTA board. It's an unbelievable organization, but the short answer to that one is no. And I'm not sure Tom Prendergast or any. And look, the MTA is an extraordinary agency. I mentioned one of our assets is PATH, right? We carry 77 million people a year between New York and New Jersey. I grew up in Queens, taking the 7 train. The 7 train alone carries 100 million passengers a year, speaking 120 languages. I just made it up. It's probably 140 languages. And the other thing is the PATH system in total has got 13 stops, 6 in Manhattan, 7 in New Jersey. The 7 train, I went to the trouble of counting. I think it's got 19. And the reason I cite that example is not to diminish the importance of the PATH, because it's an incredibly important piece of the transportation infrastructure here. But the MTA is a massive, I'll note with all due respect, money-losing operation, and that's because of public transit, right? Public transit in the United States is a money-losing operation. Port Authority, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. Port Authority is I don't say this with any degree of hubris, but we're a self-supporting organization in the sense that we don't get any state support, nor are we asking for any, from the state of New York or the state of New Jersey, and we don't get operating support from the federal government. So we're dependent on toll and fare revenue and lease payments from airlines and passenger facility charges at the airports and other revenue streams. So I'll decline that kind offer. With respect to the cruise business, important industry in New York. We're Port Authority's players, both in Red Hook, Brooklyn. We're about 20 or so ships call each year, and then significantly more calls on the New Jersey side. I think that people increasingly want to avoid flying to Florida and getting on a cruise ship, and this, depending on seasonality, obviously, and the weather, the cruise ship departures in New York or New Jersey offer the opportunity to get on a cruise ship and go to the Bahamas or the Caribbean, et cetera. So I see a continued growth. Obviously, it's going to be dependent in part on the level of economic activity and people's disposable income. Happily, from a consumer point of view, there is a excess of capacity in the cruise ship industry, so pricing has really come down, and it's made it available to a lot more consumers. But I think there'll be continued growth.
Yes, I'm John Marcos. Our population's increasing. What is the Port Authority doing to increase transportation traffic and capacity? I doubt we'll see another auto tunnel, but what is the Port Authority doing with respect to a new rail tunnel under the Hudson and the Manhattan bus garage or new technologies?
So Amtrak has a project called Gateway, which is a decades-long project, which is in the planning stage, and we're working with Amtrak on that and supportive of it. Just to be clear, the project, which one would look at in pieces, including the Gateway piece, is measured in billions of dollars and ultimately in tens of billions of dollars. It's going to be built over, if it is built over a decades-long period. We're supportive of it. Obviously, there's going to have to be a significant amount of federal funding in that, and I noted the federal government faces its own limitations. I think that one thing that may be have to be considered in that is some type of tax increment financing or value capture or public-private investment to make that happen. That's a lot easier when you've got predictable recurring streams of revenue, and you're breaking even. Amtrak, obviously, on an aggregate, is a money-losing operation. The Northeast Corridor Service is makes money. Not necessarily, the congressional environment for Amtrak, unfortunately, is probably more hostile than would be helpful. So we're supportive of that. I people would like to see that tunnel built. That's not going to happen anytime in the short term. In terms of additional capacity, we are building longer platforms for PATH because we think that, for instance, as One World Trade Center opens and the other buildings on the World Trade Center site. We expect that, I mentioned 77 million passengers a year. I think one could project not that far down the road that we'd hit and break 80 and grow beyond that. We're using technology at the bridges and tunnels, and, many of you commuted, east or west across our bridges and tunnels, and traffic is a real issue. I think technology can be a help on that. It's not going to deal with, addressing totally volume delays. At the airports, which I think may be the most significant drag on the economy, I think this next-gen technology that I mentioned, which is going to require significant federal investment, is a significant portion of that. I think that slot reform, just take 30 seconds on that. So the New York, JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark, together with Reagan National, are the only airports in the country subject to slot limitations, which is basically an appointment, use that term, that an airline has to make to land or take off at one of those airports. We're limited to 81 flight operations at JFK and Newark and 71 at LaGuardia during kind of the peak time of the day. We can do more flight operations. Why is that a good thing? It's a good thing because the more plane loads of Brazilians or Chileans or Germans that can come here and spend restaurant meals, hotel rooms, et cetera, good for tax revenues, but it's also good for the hospitality business, which is an important entry-level employer for lots of new Americans and recent high school graduates or community college students or graduates. And, the Mayor Bloomberg obviously has been a leader on focusing on the contribution of the 50 million visitors to the city and the economic contribution that they can make. Every time we've got to tell a Brazilian travel agency that we can't book another. I mentioned Brazilians because they're in the top 10 of visitors to New York, and they are higher than average spenders. It's a great thing when Brazilians come to New York because they spend retail, restaurants, theater, et cetera. Chileans also far smaller country, smaller population. But the rise of emerging middle classes around the world is a good thing for New York, because one of the places that people want to come as they go up the income ladder in their country is come to New York and see New York and spend money, and that's a good thing. Yes?
You've highlighted several important projects, including the Goethals Bridge, that steel will be an important component in. And the MTA came under some fire over the summer about the provision of steel from China, which has already run into trouble. We've seen in the Bay Bridge. Is there any provision in the Goethals agreement or any other agreements upcoming for the domestic sourcing of steel?
Good question. Goethals is a Buy America bridge. We're using domestic steel. I mentioned that the project's being financed with TIFIA financing. One of the requirements of getting TIFIA financing is Buy America with respect to steel. So when the new Goethals Bridge is built, you'll be able to travel across it secure in the knowledge that it's built with domestic steel. Yes. Give it up for domestic steel. Yes.
Hi, Steve Browdergham, attorney in New York City government. Could you comment on the Port Authority's efforts with respect to adaptation to climate change? Adaptation to climate change, sea level.
Good question. In the short term, couple of things. Short term, one of the lessons of Sandy, right, is that human beings in a lot of circumstances across eons of time suffer from a failure of imagination, right? And I think to some extent the 9/11 attacks were a failure of imagination because most people couldn't envision that people would fly an airplane into an office tower in New York. And I think the same is true with respect to Sandy, which is that we all suffered, planners and developers and government officials and private sector over a period of decades suffer from a failure of imagination in the sense that the previous storm had been 5.2 feet, so people thought if we planned for 6, we're going to be okay, and obviously Superstorm Sandy told us that that's not the case. The flip side of that is we've got to be all careful. Everybody's focused on Superstorm Sandy and its first anniversary. There's a saying among military historians, right, that at the beginning of a new war, the generals are always fighting the last war. And I think what we've got to do is to be careful that as we plan for the next act of God, act of nature, or act of man, that terrorism or other incident, that we're not planning for Superstorm Sandy plus 6 inches, because the next storm or act of God or act of nature is going to be different. I don't know how, but it's going to be different. we have been, just footnote, we've been planning actively at the Port Authority and running full-scale exercises at all our facilities and tabletop exercises. For instance, we're going to be a major player from a transportation point of view in the Super Bowl. And this is the first, outside public transportation, playing a significant role in moving people to the Super Bowl. So short term, we're very focused on that. Happy to say we got $1.4 billion allocation from the FTA, Federal Transit Administration, mostly for PATH, a little bit for the transportation hub at the World Trade Center. The Port Authority's long been a leader on renewable and green energy issues. I don't think we've released this publicly, but I'll say it here anyway. There are 89,000, extraordinary number, units of government in the United States, 89,000, of which 1,000 are on Long Island where I live, which is amazing. And Long Island, from a local government unit point of view, is punching above its weight. Because you do the math, right? Long Island's 3 million people, the population's 300 million, a little bit more than that, it's 1%, so you'd expect, but no, Long Island's got more local government, so good for us. So why do I say that? The Green Fleet magazine evaluated, I'm not sure they evaluated all 89,000, but they evaluated, and they found the Port Authority fleet to be number 3 in the country, and good for us. My challenge to my colleagues is, why can't we be number 1 next year? And I think last year we were 23 or something like that, so we're headed in the right direction. Port Authority's long been committed to renewable and clean energy. We've reduced significantly, as I mentioned, the emissions at the ports. We've got solar parking at both Newark and Stewart Airport. And much of for instance, we put in, to me, a really interesting thing, small thing, we put in metered taxiways and bank taxiways that will cut the time of taxiing on our airports by about 30 to 45 seconds. Huge impact when you realize that there are 370,000 flight operations at LaGuardia last year, and every second minute a plane is taxiing, burning fuel, and not in the sky is obviously fuel wasted. Airlines are very concerned about that, as are we, but also schmutz, technical term, being emitted into the atmosphere. And the more we can limit that, the better off we are. So it's been a long-term focus of the Port Authority, but Governor Cuomo and Christie, and continues to be. Yes, sir.
Hi, Kyle Hatzis from Sumitomo, project finance lender. Just had 2 questions. One is related to, I know we've talked about rail, we've talked about aviation, we've talked about boats. I was just wondering, you have this, little bus terminal on the west side of Manhattan. I was wondering if you guys had any plans or had thought strategically about what you're doing with that. And my second question would be related to JFK and LaGuardia. I know that we're talking about new airside efficiencies, bringing in more planes, bringing in more visitors, but you have serious landside constraints, especially on the roadside, that make getting to those airports nearly impossible at almost every hour of the day now. So I was just curious if there's a way for the Port Authority, or if you thought strategically about what the city and state can do potentially, or how the Port Authority can work with those governments to figure out a way to sort of alleviate some of the landside constraints that might hurt people's willingness to come to JFK and LaGuardia.
That's a really good question. I didn't mean to ignore it, so let me talk about the bus terminal first. So the bus terminal, we are making a number, actually I'm leaving here, I'm going to the bus terminal to look at new customer information kiosks that we're going to be rolling out hopefully before Thanksgiving. We've significantly improved signage and wayfaring. These information kiosks are going to be, I think, an important thing, and put more people on the floor at the bus terminal. Long term, the bus terminal, especially during Sandy, after the immediate kind of danger from the storm, I spent time nearly every day at the bus terminal. This is kind of a week after the storm, after we had gotten our operations up and running. And the bus terminal was busting at the seams, in part because the Hoboken station was closed, and neither PATH nor New Jersey Transit could commute to Penn Station, could bring commuters to Penn Station. The bus terminal was busting at the seams. And the bus terminal, so a couple answers. One is we're currently in the midst of a study about strategic options for the bus terminal. 1. 2, there are subsidies inherent in certain operators at the bus terminal that, bus terminal is a money loser. We lose about $100 million a year. And that's not a good thing for a self-supporting agency, and obviously on a entity-wide basis, we're substantially cash flow positive, or else we wouldn't have a AA minus credit, but the bus terminal needs to be rebuilt. The way that will happen in the real world is with respect to air rights and development rights over the bus terminal. There was a deal that I inherited and we let expire with one of the leading real estate developers in this town to build a tower over the bus terminal. One of the things that I think government needs to be more focused on when it designates real estate developers for real estate opportunities is to make sure that inertia, which sometimes occurs in government, doesn't allow a developer to have a free option over a period of years, and there ought to be some period at which the agreement says it's over, unless the developer begins to write option payments that don't have to be huge, but have to be enough to get his or her attention. And that was one reason I allowed the deal at the bus terminal to expire. Obviously, the real estate market around the bus terminal, New York Times building, SJP deal property, is red hot. I think there's every reason to believe that that will continue. And I think that one of the conclusions that wouldn't surprise me to come out of the bus terminal study is a new, more Port Authority favorable real estate development opportunity to pay for it. The gentleman before asked about bus parking at the bus terminal. I think that's a tough one, and they're all tough. I think we got to make progress on a new bus terminal. The question about a bus parking is how one pays for it. I think everybody would like to get those buses off the street, but a bus parking garage is hundreds of millions of dollars, and for a facility that we're currently losing $100 million on, we need to kind of crack that one. One thing just in passing is that I'm very focused on non-toll and fare revenue, because I think we've reached the natural limits, at least in the current economy, of the ability to pass along toll and fare increases. If you go back to 2000 and look at the Port Authority's increase in tolls through the fare and toll increase that the board approved in August of 2011, and compare it to CPI and growth in median household income, Port Authority Trans-Hudson commuter, one-way, round trip each business day, has increased at a rate 50% in excess of CPI and 50% in excess of the increase in median household income, which suggests that there are natural limits. And that doesn't even include, two additional factors. One is the reduction in high-paid Wall Street employers after the crash. But secondly, the increase in parking, Manhattan parking, which has increased at a rate even in excess of the increase in tolls. On the second question, landside improvements at LaGuardia and Kennedy, Central Terminal building is going to be accompanied by $1 billion of infrastructure, mostly landside, but is going to include substantially rebuilt roadways, and I think that's going to be a positive. At JFK, I think one of the things that we've been advocating for, and I'm hopeful for, is on the Van Wyck allowing larger trucks, 53-foot trucks instead of 48-foot trucks, and I'm hopeful on that. The reason 5 feet, why does it make a difference? Interesting, the math of pallet size says that going from 48 to 53 results in an increase of 20% in the amount of cargo that the larger truck can carry. It's dramatic, makes a big difference, and would, I'd argue, be good not only for roadway congestion to and from Kennedy and make it more attractive to cargo companies, but also, frankly, is better from an externality point of view for the people living in homes on, on the side of the Van Wyck.
That's the end. It's 9:30. I want to bring this to a close, but I want you to stay 1 second here. One of the justifications, and it's the true justification for authorities, is that they're building things that are going to last hundreds of years, and that you need to have professional managers to maintain, construct, and control the financing. And what you've just heard, to me, is a very good example of someone who's really taken on that responsibility and demonstrated the ability to manage the priceless infrastructure that the Port Authority has. So I want to thank you for coming here today, and it's one of the traditions here is we always like to give the speaker a product of the scholarship of New York Law School, and my colleague Jim Simon, FDR and Chief Justice Hughes. I think you'll enjoy it as a former lawyer. I guess maybe you'll go back and lawyer again. Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you all. We'll see you in February.
I wrote about the book. Thank you.